I wanted my driver's license so badly that the very first thing I did on my 16th birthday was make my way down to the Department of Motor Vehicles to take my driving test. I failed the test and I had to wait 2 weeks to take it again, but that is not the point of this story. The point is that my children never quite felt the same urgent need to get their driver's licenses the minute they could because they grew up in these large metropolitan areas where everybody takes the metro or the subway or the bus. I tell you all of this to explain why I recently found myself in the harrowing position of sitting in the passenger seat while my amazing daughter, Hannah, practiced her driving in preparation for her driver's license test in Manhattan traffic. There was a moment that day when Hannah was changing lanes on Columbus Avenue and taking her time. Blinker on, check the mirrors, make sure the next lane over is clear, and as often happens in Manhattan, an annoyed taxi driver who also wanted to change lanes started honking at her. He was still honking after Hannah successfully changed lanes, and as my heartbeat gradually slowed down, Hannah said, offhand, in reference to the still honking taxi driver, "That guy needs Jesus." I thought about that experience this week when I was reading Acts chapter 10, the story we just heard. It's the story of someone definitely needing Jesus, needing to be converted. To understand what's going on in this story, though, it's important to know the background. So remember, by this time, Jesus was gone, and the institution that would carry his message, the church, had just been born. Even right at the beginning of the church, there was some pretty serious dissension, a controversy that threatened to break the unity of the group. Simon Peter, an original disciple of Jesus, and Paul, a newer convert and also a compelling leader, were each trying to build the infrastructure to set certain standards for this new group of Jesus followers. Each was at the head of two camps, and each felt deeply convicted that his position was the right one. The group led by Paul held the opinion that Jesus' message was one that should be proclaimed through the whole world, not just in Jerusalem and the surrounding regions where Jesus preached and lived, and that anybody who wanted to be part of living out that message should be welcomed in with open arms, even, and this is the scandalous part, non-Jews. Welcomed in, just as they were. Leading the other camp was Simon Peter, main character in our passage today. Peter was very devout, and he was convinced if you decided that you believed in Jesus, the first step you're going to take, of course, is to convert to Judaism. You will go through all the rites of Jewish identity and assume an upright Jewish lifestyle with all the dietary restrictions and Levitical rules that entailed. And then you could join the Jesus movement. The problem was that after Pentecost, when the Spirit came and people from all over heard the message of the gospel, there were so many who wanted to become part of the group of Jesus followers. Acts chapter 2 says over 3,000 people. But they couldn't understand what their embrace of Jesus' message had to do with joining the temple or becoming a practicing Jew. And this controversy that was stirring in the first church, well, that's the backdrop for the amazing story that Luke reports and our wonderful readers shared with us from the 10th chapter of the book of Acts. So keep that backstory in mind as I remind you of what happened. Cornelius, he was a centurion of the Italian cohort, which means nothing to you and me today, but we should be aware Cornelius was an extremely high-ranking official in the Roman army, about the furthest thing away from a Jewish fisherman like Peter, as you could imagine. Cornelius was not a Jew, and he did not have any interest in becoming Jewish. And in fact, converting to Judaism was grounds for immediate dismissal from the army. But as you heard, he was a devout man who feared God, and one day Cornelius prayed. He heard God's voice telling him to search out a man called Simon Peter, the Jewish fisherman, and so he did. Then, meanwhile, back at the seashore, Simon Peter, staying at the house of a friend, on the roof, praying his daily prayer, he saw a vision. But this one was a little stranger than Cornelius's. So imagine this: Peter, devout Jew, committed follower of Jesus Christ, saw a sheet coming down from heaven. And on that sheet were all kinds of animals, even animals that were clearly named in the Levitical code as unclean. Bizarrely, the voice that Peter heard told him to kill and eat the animals. Well, you can imagine how shocking this was for Peter. No way was Peter going to breach Jewish law to do something he had learned his whole life was unclean, forbidden. Peter knew, you see, that there are certain standards for faithful, holy living, and he could recite them from memory as he'd been able to do since he was a small child. But then Peter heard the voice again, and this time Peter knew it was God, and God had stern words for him. Peter, what God has called clean, you must not call unclean. So, Peter's still trying to figure out what all of this could possibly mean. As you heard, 3 men knocked on his door and invited him to the home of Cornelius, the Roman centurion, to tell him about the message of Jesus. And it was just then that the light dawned, and Peter figured it out. The way that he had been thinking about who was in and who was out would have sent him straight to Cornelius' home to tell him he was going to have to convert to Judaism in order to become part of the church. But after that vision, Peter could finally see the certain standards that he had been clinging to so very tightly did not in any way reflect the message of Jesus' lavish love, lavish and all-encompassing love. They may have represented the institution of religion, but those words kept ringing in Peter's ears. What God has called clean, you must not call unclean. Even institutional religion is not the final arbiter of who is in and who is out. It's only God who can decide that. And God created Peter and Cornelius and you and me as beloved children made in God's image. It was a surprise to him, but it was the truth of the moment. As Hannah would say, Peter needed Jesus. He needed to be converted, and he was. Today is Pride Sunday, as you can see, and immediately following worship, many of us will be on the Riverside Church float in the Pride Parade, proclaiming the message that every person is loved, affirmed, accepted, and celebrated by God in this institution that bears God's name. That's an incredible witness. But even Riverside did not get to this position without having to break down certain standards. A little piece of Riverside history tells the story. 1985 was the height of the AIDS crisis. People were dying at an alarming rate, and many, many, many people in the Riverside community were affected and impacted. A few years before, the LGBTQ group in the church, Maranatha, had been founded, and in late 1984, the church started holding committee meetings to try to work toward a statement declaring the Riverside congregation totally open and affirming, fully accepting. But on May 5th, 1985, a communion Sunday, the executive minister of the church stepped into this pulpit and preached an incendiary sermon condemning homosexuality. In it, he defined as the parable of human sexuality, marriage between a man and a woman as described in the book of Genesis. These hard words, he said in his sermon, imply that deviation from the parable of the heterosexual relationship ordained by Genesis is contrary to God's will and is therefore, and I know we don't like to hear it, is therefore sin. It's hard for me 34 years later to even imagine such a thing happening here, but it did. Many people got up and walked out during the sermon, undoubtedly disappointed yet again by an institution claiming to represent God. But some people stayed. One of them was a member named Whit Hutchison, who got up out of his pew and walked to the front of the church right here and invited people with a strong need to express their difference with the words spoken from the pulpit to gather in a circle around the communion table and to stand, expressing their protest and unwillingness to align themselves with the words of the preacher. About 200 people came up and joined him, and they stood to say, if the standards that you hold call anyone unclean, excluded, unwanted, or anything less than a precious child of God, welcomed with full inclusion into this Jesus movement we call the church, well then, your standards have got to change. And because of what those people did, and because of the hard work and witness of so many other Riversiders, on June 2nd, 1985, this church adopted a statement of full openness and inclusion for every person. Now, this is a little unusual to do during a sermon, but there are some of you here who actually came up here and stood. If you were one of those people, would you stand right now? That's the kind of radical witness that Jesus was talking about when he said, anyone who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God. Thank you. Now, some might call a statement of full inclusion like that a violation of certain standards. And some might call a statement like that following Jesus. It's not news to anyone here that institutional religion has got it wrong over and over and over again on this issue as well as many others. I mean, women preaching in the pulpit? Talk about breaking the rules. I'm joking, but this is very serious. The church can break our hearts more often than it does the gospel work of healing us. People have died because messages from religious institutions convinced them that somehow they were unclean, unwanted. But as I often say, the church is not God. The church is a human institution filled with people who worry a lot about certain standards. And when we exclude and hurt one another using those rules, we stray from reflecting the gospel message. And like Peter, we need to be converted again and again. What God has called clean, you must not call unclean. I hope you have read what is posted all over this building and on our church website. You are safe here. You are loved here. You are invited into full participation in our life together. That's the gospel. That's the message of Jesus. You, all of you, are precious, beloved children of God. And anyone, even the institution that claims the authority of God, who tells you different, well, they need Jesus. Amen.